There was a time when the stars whispered of promise, when the hyperspace lanes ran clean, bright lines through the dark, and worlds felt near, almost known. That was before the storm came, before the Nihil. They called them raiders, pirates, marauders, but those names were too small. The Nihil were not just outlaws, they were an idea, a storm without center, a fury without law, not bound by honor, not guided by code. They struck not for territory or conquest, but for chaos, driven by a gospel of disorder written in blood and static. Their ships were unlike any seen before, webbed and jagged, like the skeletons of sea creatures stretched across space. They called them storm ships. Rope-like anchor cables wrapped around hulls in spiraled tension, connecting each vessel to the next in winding patterns. At their lead, the largest of them unfurled a sail, black as vacuum, shimmering faintly with electric veins. It did not catch wind, but bent light itself as it plunged into hyperspace, a spear of darkness slicing through the galaxy's spine. The outer rim, long, wild, and stubborn, became their hunting ground. No beacon was safe. The Nihil appeared where logic said they shouldn't, past drift points, behind asteroids, in the blind spot between pulses. Hyperspace itself bent for them, twisted by secrets no Republic sensor could trace. One moment, a convoy floated through clean transit. The next, alarms wailed and the void cracked open like torn cloth. Their raids were not coordinated by command ships or navigational charts. They moved according to paths whispered only among themselves, through so-called paths, buried routes granted by a single seer. Few outside their ranks knew how it worked. Fewer survived to tell. And when the storm came, it was always too late. They didn't take prisoners in the traditional sense. Supplies were stripped, databanks gutted, communications severed. Entire fleets were reduced to drifting silence before they even knew they'd been touched. Then the Nihil would vanish, scattered to 100 vectors like wind through broken leaves. Nothing left behind but debris and dread. In the wake of each attack, a strange stillness lingered. No one trusted the routes anymore. What had once been a republic of connected worlds, threaded by confidence in travel and trade, began to fracture. Systems turned inward. Relief missions grew sparse. Merchants refused to fly. The idea of safety, of shared progress, began to erode. And in the darkness that followed, tales began to spread. Of a sail like a wound across the stars. Of masked riders who screamed without sound. Of ghost ships that slipped between real space and nothingness. These were not war stories. They were warnings. At the center of it all, hidden even from most within the organization, was something else. A shape barely glimpsed, spoken of in fragmented tones, a figure known only as the Eye. But for now, the Eye remained in shadow. And the galaxy, still unaware of what lay ahead, saw only the edge of the storm. For the Nihil were not yet a great army, not yet a movement. They were lightning, erratic, brilliant, deadly. But they would become more. And the Republic, bloated by optimism, blind in its pride, could not yet see that these scattered raiders, these so-called savages of the Rim, were more than mere disruptors. They were the wind howling before the collapse, the warning breath before the scream. Out beyond the core, in the dark lanes where the stars whispered wrong, the Nihil gathered, and they rode the storm into legend. Beyond the starfields scarred by sudden violence, Deeper still into the drift space where charts give way to silence, a shadowed order rises, neither empire nor cult, but something more volatile. The Nihil, as they call themselves, are no singular force. They are a tempest, fractured, ungoverned, and deliberately unstable. And at the storm's core dwell the Tempest runners. There are four: Kasif, Pan, Lorna, and Zetar, each a warlord in name, but chaos incarnate in practice. Their command is not earned through lineage or diplomacy, but through dominance, deception, and the spectacle of destruction. They answer to no code, follow no charter. Power is the only compass in their void. The runners are not generals. They are architects of disruption. Each controls a tempest, a fleet of ships bound not by uniform, but by mutual gain, and a shared thirst for what others call disorder. Pan leads with fire, his strikes flamboyant and surgical. Kasif, a broker of secrets, conquers with threats whispered through the stars. Lorna, icy and mercurial, bends minds before she breaks them. Zetar, behind a mask of ancient alloys, rules through overwhelming force and the cold efficiency of machines. They are siblings only in their contempt for structure. And above them all, or perhaps beneath them, depending on who you ask, rests the eye of the Nihil. The eye does not give orders. The eye offers paths. To the Nihil, the eye is a prophet and prophetess both, one who sees through the weave of reality, charting impossible courses through hyperspace. His gift is not control. It is belief. His vision, myth. His name, Martian Row. And to those within the storm, his word is law. But not because it is enforced, because it is feared. In a vaulted chamber at the heart of a drifting bastion, an asteroid hollowed and fortified, the four runners gather when summoned. Their boots echo against obsidian floors, slick with moisture from vented vapor. Around them, storm lamps sway from bronze chains, casting lightning-mimicked light across a circular dais. Smoke clings low to the floor, thick with oils, stims, and blood rituals too old to trace. Here, they kneel not to the eye, but to the power he claims to channel. Marchon stands at the circle's center, face veiled beneath a lattice of cracked transparasteel. His voice is measured, but his silence weighs heavier. Each runner listens not for his commands, but for his direction, his provided path, his vision through the Maelstrom. It is not loyalty that binds them, it is dependence. For without the eye's paths, their fleets are blind in hyperspace, and blindness in this galaxy is death. Each path given is a blessing, a curse, a test. The Nihil do not follow the eye because he leads. They follow him because, somehow, he knows where Republic patrols will not be, where refugee ships falter, where trade convoys loop their longest arcs. He speaks these secrets into air, and the runners strike. Yet even among the chaos, tensions crackle. Pan plots against Zetar, resents his machine-regimented Tempest. Lorna moves in whispers, hoarding plunder and forging alliances beneath cloaks of feigned unity. Kasif listens more than he speaks, and records everything. The chamber, for all its rituals and binding words, is not a place of unity. It is a stage, a trap, a crucible where each player schemes behind smiling masks. But for now, they bow. For now, they obey. Not out of reverence, out of necessity. For in this chaos, Marchon Row has given them something even fear cannot command. Purpose. And as their ships unfurl like jagged sails across the stars, each lurching into space with violence and laughter, the Nihil do not march as soldiers. They ride as riders of a storm unbound by law or mercy. And the eye watches from within the storm, unseen, unmoved. Yet all around, whispers grow louder. Jedi murmur of darkness drifting between systems. Republic chatter fills comms with tales of vanishings, of ships that scream into hyperspace and never return. And from the outermost reach of the galactic spiral, a signal flickers. An anomaly, a rupture, a scream swallowed by silence. The Jedi, curious and cautious, begin to investigate.
And so begins the next clash. One not of armies, but of fate and fracture.
We move now to that first collision of light and shadow, where guardians of peace first encounter chaos incarnate. The signal came without pattern, a ripple, barely a whisper, threading its way through the deep. It was not a distress call in the conventional sense. No codes, no voices, only a static-laced pulse, repeating like a heartbeat against the void. It emanated from a sector known for its silence, a stretch of stars rarely mapped, even more rarely traversed. The Jedi responded. 3 ships launched from a nearby outpost along the Republic's expansion corridor. Vanguard-class starfighters, piloted by knights whose instincts had not yet been dulled by bureaucracy. They moved with caution, their formations loose, senses open. The Force guided them, not through clear visions, but with a growing sense of fracture, as if something, unseen, unmeasured, was wrong with the space itself. The first rupture occurred as they entered the designated system. The galaxy tilted. One moment, stars glittered in perfect arrays. The next, a rift bloomed like a wound in the firmament. A gash of iridescent color spun outward, distorting light, reshaping gravity. The lead Jedi's controls failed instantly. His fighter veered without command, caught in the unseen pull of the anomaly. Through his cockpit window, he glimpsed something impossible. A sail, black as obsidian, jagged as bone, riding the slipstream beside him, somehow keeping pace inside the rift. And then it was gone. Just before his navicomputer failed entirely, he managed to transmit one phrase. Not space, a snare. Only one Jedi made it back. Master Trevin Solari emerged from the breach alone, his fighter battered, hull scorched by energies no sensor could classify. His breathing was slow, his posture tense, but it was his eyes, wide, unfocused, that told the real story. In the debriefing chamber, he spoke in fragments. There was no warning, he said. The lanes shifted, like they let us enter. The Council, at first, dismissed it as a spatial anomaly. But in secret sessions, they began to consult their archives. The paths, once thought myths, appeared again in the margins of ancient star charts, scribed in symbols, wrapped in riddles, shortcuts through hyperspace that should not exist. And yet, someone was using them. In the weeks that followed, more disappearances occurred. Convoys scheduled to arrive never did. Communication satellites picked up flares, then silence. Patrols went missing. In each case, the area had been declared stable, the hyperspace lanes safe. The Jedi soon realized they weren't fighting pirates. They were chasing ghosts. Marchion Rose paths gave the Nihil more than mobility. They gave them unpredictability, access points between systems no other faction could see. They could appear anywhere, vanish before reinforcements arrived, strike without any need for strategy as the Republic understood it. Each attack was chaos by design. The Jedi tried to adapt. Scouting squadrons began flying erratic routes, hoping to avoid ambushes. But the Nihil did not follow patterns. They were the disruption, and every Jedi who flew into a hyperspace fracture came back, altered. Not always in body, but in spirit, shaken by what they'd seen, unmoored from certainty. On one mission, a knight named Orla Jareni encountered what she later described as a scream without sound. Her vessel had been separated from her wingmate. While navigating a tunnel of warping light, she saw structures outside her ship. Huge, silent spires hanging in impossible space. Nihil vessels drifted between them like carrion birds, watching, waiting. And somewhere beneath it all, the Force felt thin, as though it no longer flowed cleanly, but stuttered, caught, as if struggling to breathe. She survived, but never spoke of that mission again. The Order began to worry, not about numbers lost, but about something deeper, an erosion, as if the presence of these Marauders wasn't just attacking ships and settlements, but the Force itself. Jedi meditations turned restless. Visions became obscured. The currents that once felt so certain now twisted unpredictably. And still, the Nihil danced in and out of reach, a riddle cloaked in thunder. The High Council convened a formal response. Task forces, analysis units, efforts to decode the anomalous hyperspace routes. But every step they took felt behind. The Nihil always seemed to know where they weren't looking. And through it all, Martian Row watched from behind the storm. But fractures once opened rarely stay contained. Something had shifted, something more than war. And from the void between worlds, a storm was gathering shape. The warning came too late. A Republic convoy, designated Freight Line Aurex-7, slid through the edge of the Ataraxia sector, a chain of vessels stretched like beads across hyperspace. Transports, medical frigates, and refueling barges moved with practiced unity, their routes charted, their path deemed secure by the Republic's central traffic nexus. But hyperspace had no loyalty. Midway through the transit, the lead transport stuttered, not mechanically, but cosmically. The lights along its corridor flickered, sensors blinked into error, and for a heartbeat, the ship drifted. Not through normal space, not even through hyperspace, but into something colder. From that sliver of disruption came the Nihil. They burst from a storm breach, not like ships exiting hyperspace, but like predators tearing through the fabric of reality. Long, sinewed vessels twisted out of the void, wrapped in black sails that shimmered with kinetic discharge. They didn't approach with formation or logic. They swarmed. The convoy's defense cruisers activated their countermeasures. Auto turrets spun, shield arrays flared to life. But it wasn't enough. Not against tactics that defied anticipation. The Nihil didn't strike at the strongest points. They didn't aim for destruction. They aimed for collapse. They crippled engines, sliced comm relays, and targeted the vessels that carried life support. In less than 5 minutes, 4 ships had lost propulsion. 3 were venting atmosphere. 1 had simply vanished, yanked back into the breach. Aboard the medical freighter Heliox, a nurse named Rin Tarmo recorded a final log. They didn't fire at us. They latched on, tore through the hull like it was skin. I saw one of them, through the viewport, standing on the outer plating. No suit, just a mask and a cloak, watching, like we were insects under glass. By the time the Republic's response fleet arrived, the sky over the planet Keritus was full of drifting corpses of metal. The convoy had been dismantled, not obliterated, but hollowed out. Every ship left behind was a message, not one repeated tactic, not one discernible signature, no pattern to trace, just chaos. The Jedi, who arrived hours later, felt no presence in the Force. It was as though the Nihil had not been there at all. Only residual trauma clung to the wreckage. And silence. Too much silence. This was not a war of fronts or siegecraft. This was erosion, precision devastation designed to sap trust. The Nihil had no interest in territory. They wanted corridors, routes, the arteries of commerce, diplomacy, aid. They turned lifelines into liabilities. Their message was whispered through wreckage. Nowhere is safe. And behind it all, the Tempest runners thrived. Each attack bore a different signature. Lorna D favored brutality, firing on escape pods, leaving only shattered hulls. Pan Eta preferred disruption, seizing cargo, then scattering it across neighboring systems to spark panic. Zetar sent drones to broadcast garbled footage of screaming victims, warping them into disinformation. The last runner, Kasav Miliko, simply vanished into the mists between raids, his strikes impossible to trace. Above them all, Marchion Ro offered no guidance, only permissions. The Jedi called a conclave. They gathered in the temple's north chamber, the light through the skylights fractured by the setting sun. Masters debated the nature of the threat, whether to pursue the Tempest runners directly or bolster systems that had become targets. Some advocated diplomacy, others preemptive force. But none of them could answer the central question: how do you fight an enemy that doesn't stay? How do you defend the map when the map itself is broken? And still, the Nihil struck. Not just convoys now, but stations, relays, relief ships, even hospitals. Their raids left not only wreckage, but dread. Local systems began to close their borders, trusting neither Republic escort nor Jedi reassurances. Governors issued planetary lockdowns. Trade began to slow, and in that vacuum, fear grew. One Jedi, stationed along the periphery, sent a single encrypted message back to Coruscant. We don't understand what they're doing. That's the point. We keep trying to find strategy in chaos. But the storm doesn't think. It consumes. In orbit over one such ravaged world, debris spiraled in slow motion. Transports, once proud, now drifted in silence. No distress signals, no flares, only shadows and starlight. In the depths of their raiding ships, the Nihil did not gather under banners or crests. They gathered under something darker. A vision, a promise, a doctrine that had seeped into every fractured corner of their collective mind. It was called the Code of the Eye, and it was a fire that burned within them, a flame that burned from the heart of the Tempest itself. The Eye was more than just a symbol. It was a philosophy, an idea born of the shattered remains of the galaxy's structure. To the Nihil, the galaxy was a thing of order, stifling and rigid, its grand institutions designed to limit freedom and crush individuality. The Jedi, the Republic, the Sith, they were all pieces of the same machine, and that machine had no place for those who wished to carve their own path. At the center of it all stood Skniv, the progenitor of their rebellion, whose teachings were now etched deep in the psyche of every Tempest runner and Marauder. His voice, immortalized in the fracturing of laws and belief, spoke of chaos not as destruction, but as freedom. He had seen the galaxy as it was, decaying under the weight of its own stagnation, and he had chosen to burn it down, to tear it apart so that it could rise anew, free of chains. The Eye was born from his teachings. To those who followed it, the concept of order was a trap, an illusion. The chaos they reveled in was not random or mindless. It was deliberate. It was creation through destruction. The Nihil embraced it as the only true form of existence. A freedom that came not from peace, but from upheaval. In a cold, dim chamber aboard the Gale Serpent, the ship of one of the Tempest runners, a manifesto was carved into the ship's outer plating. The steel, long scratched and battered from countless battles, bore the scars of countless lives claimed. But the scrawlings that marred it now told a story older than the ship itself. The words were crude, scrawled hastily, but they burned with clarity. The language was simple, the phrasing stark, but it was all too clear to those who could read it. In the Eye, we find our freedom. In the Eye, we are reborn. Let the galaxy tear itself apart. Let the stars burn. Let the cities fall. We ride the storm. We become the storm. Only then will we be free. Each Tempest runner carried a version of this manifesto within their ships, whether it was burned into metal or etched in the darkness of their hearts. It was a creed, a binding pact, a contract not just with each other, but with the storm itself. To the Nihil, the galaxy's rules were no more than chains that bound those too afraid to live outside them. The Jedi, those self-righteous keepers of peace, were blind to the beauty of chaos. They saw only the fragility of the order they had built, terrified of losing their power, their control, their purity. Skniv had taught them to see the world differently, to embrace the mess, the imperfections, the entropy of it all. Through chaos, they were liberated. Through destruction, they would rebuild something greater. Yet, it was not all total anarchy. There was a method to their madness. The code of the Eye called for one thing above all: unity through freedom. The Tempest runners, though anarchic in nature, were bound by this philosophy. They did not answer to one another through fear or loyalty, but through shared belief. The belief that the galaxy would fall, and in its fall, they would rise as something more, something untethered, wild, and free. Their raids were not just tactical, they were ritualistic. Each strike, each explosion, was a prayer, a chant of rebellion against the very stars themselves. They would burn through hyperspace, disrupt the flow of commerce, and scatter Republic fleets like ash on the wind. But in doing so, they would create a galaxy unshackled, one where they were free to claim whatever they wanted. In the storm chambers of their ships, where storm lamps flickered like dying stars, the Tempest runners gathered. They spoke of Sniv, of the Eye, and of the future they would shape. Their voices were low, but their words carried the weight of prophecy. They did not whisper in fear, they whispered in reverence. The future was theirs to claim. As the Eye's influence spread, more joined their ranks: pirates, outcasts, those cast aside by the Republic's machine, the disillusioned, the broken. They all saw the Eye as salvation. It was more than rebellion, it was transcendence, a call to rise above the mundane, to become something more, to become part of the storm. The chase began in silence. The stars, infinite and distant, bore witness to the unfolding tension as the Jedi task force followed the whispers of the Nihil. They were told of a hidden fleet, one that moved like shadows through the galaxy, slipping between the cracks of hyperspace. No one had seen it directly, at least not, and lived to speak of it. But the Force whispered of its presence. And so, the Jedi followed, driven by instinct, by the flickering pulse of the living galaxy itself. The task force was small, only a handful of starfighters, sleek and poised. Their mission was simple: track the Nihil's elusive fleet and report back to the Republic. What they did not know was that this would not be a simple reconnaissance mission. They would find themselves drawn into a deadly game, a high-stakes pursuit through fields of shattered hulls and drifting wreckage, where the line between hunter and prey would blur. Their destination was the debris field, known as the Tariq Expanse, a graveyard of forgotten ships that had once sought the safer lanes of hyperspace. Now, it was a treacherous labyrinth where the Nihil were rumored to pass, slipping unnoticed among the wrecks. The Jedi navigated the field with practiced precision, their ships weaving in and out of the twisted remains of what was once a convoy. Long-dead hulks, now half-absorbed by the cold of space. The air inside their cockpits was tense, charged with anticipation. The hum of their engines was a constant undercurrent, and each turn, each calculated drift, felt as though it were on the verge of revealing something massive, something that would change the course of their mission, their lives. But it was in the silence between the stars where the danger lay. For the Nihil did not play by the rules of conventional war. Their raids were not coordinated. They were born from chaos, exploiting the very forces that the Jedi had learned to master. The Nihil's unpredictability was their greatest weapon. They would strike when least expected. They would slip through the cracks. As the Jedi task force made their way deeper into the expanse, the debris became thicker, more concentrated, like the bones of an ancient battlefield. Massive fragments drifted slowly, some caught in the grip of gravity wells, others just frozen in space, their silent hulks scarred by the passage of time and war. There was no sign of the Nihil, only the remains of those who had fallen before. The Jedi, however, were not fooled. They could feel it, an unshakable sense of being watched. The Force told them to keep moving, to trust in their instincts. And yet, the tension in the air thickened with every passing moment. And then, there it was. A flicker, a disturbance, barely perceptible, yet unmistakable. A dark shape moving among the debris. One ship, then another, sliding through the remnants of a shattered hull. The Nihil had been waiting, watching, hidden from their sight all along. Without warning, the silence shattered. A burst of fire erupted from the shadows, and the Jedi task force scrambled to respond. Their starfighters darted through the field, weaving and dodging, their weapons flashing in the cold void. Blasts ricocheted off the twisted remains of derelict ships, lighting up the dark expanse like a series of brief, violent sparks. The Nihil were relentless, unpredictable in their movements. They did not care for conventional tactics. Instead, they embraced the chaos of the moment, using it to their advantage. A Jedi starfighter veered too close to a large fragment of an old freighter. In an instant, it was torn from its path by an explosion, debris cascading outward, leaving the pilot to fight against the void. But there was no time to mourn. The Nihil would not stop. The Jedi were forced into a deadly game of cat and mouse, each maneuver more daring than the last. Their ships careened around debris, their pilots pushing the limits of what was possible, trusting in the Force to guide them as they weaved through the wreckage. It was a battle of patience and precision. One wrong move, and the cost would be too great. A lone starfighter, leading the pursuit, darted between twisted beams of metal, its hull narrowly avoiding a massive wreckage as it sped past. The Nihil were close now, the dark shapes of their ships dancing just beyond the Jedi's reach. It was as if the very debris field itself had come alive, shifting with the ebb and flow of battle. In the midst of the chaos, a sudden realization struck the Jedi. The Nihil were not just hiding in the debris, they were becoming part of it. They were using the field itself as their cover, moving with the wreckage as if they were one with it. It was a strategy the Jedi had not expected, a tactic that bent the very fabric of their training. The cat and mouse continued, faster now, the Jedi growing more desperate to break through the darkness. The Nihil were elusive, their attacks swift, their evasions masterful. And yet, for every blow they landed, the Jedi grew more certain that they were closing in on something far greater. This was not just a chase. It was a war that was unfolding in the shadows, one where the Jedi were both the prey and the hunter. But the Nihil had the advantage here. The battlefield was their domain. And in this darkness, where even the stars seemed to disappear, the Jedi could not help but wonder, what lay beyond the veil of this shadow? The storm was not just a force of nature. It was a test, an eternal trial that stretched beyond the physical. To face the Tempest runners was to stand at the very edge of chaos itself, and Jedi Knight Valen Voss had come to understand that this confrontation was as much a battle within as it was a struggle against the Marauders of the Nihil. The Tempest runner before him was a storm incarnate, ruthless, fast, and ever-changing. Her name was Zala Hax, a figure of myth among the Nihil, known for her brutal tactics and uncanny ability to turn the very chaos of battle into a weapon. Her ship, a vessel of sleek black armor and spiked projections, seemed to slice through the Maelstrom like a knife, its every movement reflecting the anarchic philosophy she had so fervently embraced. But for Voss, there was no room for fear. As a Jedi, he had faced countless dangers, but none so raw and primal as the one that awaited him now. His mission was clear: neutralize the Tempest runner before she could lead her Marauders to strike at the heart of the Republic. And yet, the closer he drew to the heart of the storm, the more he realized that his adversary was not just a skilled fighter, but a master of the Tempest itself. The battle began as all others did, calm, measured, controlled. But Voss quickly realized this fight would be anything but. The Maelstrom roared to life, crackling with the intensity of 100 storms. Zala Hax was at the center of it, a force of nature itself, wielding the chaos like a blade. Her strikes came fast and without warning, each one a flicker of deadly energy. Voss parried, his purple lightsaber held steady against the onslaught, the crackling lightning of the storm illuminating the battlefield in brief flashes. The two fighters danced through the chaos, their movements as fluid as the storm that surrounded them. The battlefield was not one of open space, but a shifting, ever-changing environment. Wreckage from 1,000 battles hung suspended in the air, debris swirling around them like the broken pieces of a shattered world. Each move Voss made was countered by a sudden burst of wind, a flash of lightning, or a rogue fragment of metal that threatened to tear him from his path. The Tempest runner moved with uncanny precision, her strikes almost poetic in their brutality. Her saber was a blur of crimson as she attacked from every angle, her presence as overwhelming as the storm itself. And yet, Voss stood firm, his purple blade flashing as it met hers with the hum of energy against energy. Each strike tested not only his physical skill, but his mind and spirit. For in the midst of the storm, where every element seemed to be alive with danger, there was no place for hesitation. The storm tested his patience. It tested his resolve. As the two warriors clashed, the very air seemed to crackle with intensity. Voss could feel the weight of the force around him, thick and tangible, guiding his movements, whispering through him like a silent voice. It was in this moment that he understood. This was not just a battle of blades. It was a battle of will, a contest of who could hold steady against the storm within. Zala Hax's eyes burned with a wild intensity, the storm reflecting in her gaze. She reveled in the chaos, in the rush of combat, in the freedom that came with the destruction she wrought. To her, this was not a fight. It was an affirmation of the Nihil's core belief. That order was a lie, and only through the embrace of chaos could true power be realized. But Voss was a Jedi. He believed in balance, in harmony. Even in the heart of the storm, he knew that he could find the center, a still point in the whirlwind. He focused, his breath steady, his heart calm. The lightning crackled around him, but he did not flinch. The storm might have been Zala's weapon, but it was not his. His weapon was peace. With a sudden shift in the flow of the battle, Voss leapt forward, his lightsaber blazing through the air in a graceful arc. The Tempest runner blocked, but the force of the strike knocked her off balance. For a brief moment, Voss could see her vulnerability, an opening in the storm. It was fleeting, but it was enough. In that instant, the Jedi pressed his advantage. His saber cut through the lightning, a streak of purple that seemed to cut through the very heart of the chaos. Zala Hax stumbled, her guard faltering as the storm swirled around her. But before Voss could land the final blow, the Maelstrom shifted again, and she was gone, swallowed by the storm. The Tempest runner was not defeated. Not yet. But Voss had proven something vital to himself in that moment. That even in the heart of the storm, a Jedi could stand strong, unwavering, against the chaos. As the winds died down and the remnants of the battle settled, the Jedi Knight looked out across the battlefield. The storm had not broken, but he had endured it. And with that, he had taken the first step in a much larger war. The Nihil were relentless, but so too was the will of the Jedi. And no matter how fierce the Tempest, they would never be lost in it. The fortress world of Valo stood as a beacon of strength amidst the High Republic's outward reach. A stronghold encircled by gleaming towers and fortified walls. It was a symbol of the Republic's promise to protect its citizens, of its will to preserve order in the face of the ever-encroaching darkness. And yet, as the Nihil approached, the city's defenses, once thought impenetrable, crumbled before the merciless assault. In the skies above Valo, the storm clouds of war gathered. The Nihil's black sails pierced the atmosphere, cutting through the heavens like shadows that swallowed the light. Marauder ships descended upon the planet in unrelenting waves, each Tempest runner leading their forces with a brutal, chaotic precision. The city, once vibrant with life, now lay under a cloak of smoke and ash, its towering walls flickering with the pale glow of distant explosions. Aboard one of the last surviving Republic cruisers, Commander Yara Voss looked down at the burning horizon below. Her hands gripped the console with white-knuckled tension, her face set in a mask of determination. "We cannot hold them off forever," she whispered to herself, though her words were lost to the roar of alarms. In the distance, her final defense, Valo's central citadel, glowed like a dying star, its walls falling one by one as the Nihil pressed forward. The attack had come without warning, as they always did. The Nihil were masters of chaos, exploiting every hyperspace anomaly to strike where they were least expected. This time, their raid had been precise, their numbers overwhelming. Their objective was clear: take Valo's resources, destabilize the Republic's grip on the Outer Rim, and send a message to anyone foolish enough to resist. But amidst the unfolding destruction, there was still a glimmer of hope. As the city's defenses faltered, Voss had been tasked with leading a civilian rescue operation, a seemingly impossible mission in the heart of the siege. There was no room for hesitation. Valo's citizens needed to be evacuated, their lives pulled from the jaws of annihilation. Voss and her team fought through the inferno of burning streets, their heavy boots pounding against the cracked stone, their path lit by the flickering flames of collapsing buildings. The distant rumble of bombardment shook the ground beneath their feet. The Nihil were everywhere, their Marauders, their Tempest runners, each one a harbinger of destruction, moved through the city, leaving nothing but wreckage in their wake. The Republic forces had been spread too thin, their numbers outmatched by the sheer brutality of the Nihil assault. But Voss, along with her squad of soldiers and a small group of Jedi, pressed forward, rescuing the injured and guiding the frightened citizens through the labyrinth of burning streets. The gate to the city was already aflame when Voss and her team reached it, the blackened iron banners of the Nihil fluttering in the wind. Their ships hovered just beyond the walls, their engines growling in anticipation as the Marauders prepared to push deeper into the heart of Valo. Each step they took was a testament to the Republic's unwavering resolve. But as the gates threatened to give way, it was clear: time was running out. "Commander, the civilians are in the courtyard ahead," said Jedi Knight Seris Val, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. He gestured toward the mass of people huddled in the shadow of the city's last standing fortress. "We need to move them now." Voss nodded. "Get them to the ships. I'll cover you." And so, with the gates groaning in protest, the final evacuation began. The sound of crackling fire and distant explosions filled the air as the Republic forces formed a shield around the civilians. Every step they took was a march into the unknown, toward a fragile hope that might break under the weight of the storm. The walls of the citadel trembled as the Nihil breached them, their Marauders flooding the city like a tidal wave of destruction. Their laughter rang out, cruel and victorious, echoing through the streets as they stormed Valo's once pristine halls. But in the face of such ruin, there was still a flicker of resistance, a final stand against the inevitable. In the courtyard, Voss's squad pushed the last of the civilians into the waiting transports. The sky above them churned with dark clouds, the fires of battle licking at their heels. The Nihil had almost claimed the city, but they had not claimed everything. As the transports ascended into the smoke-choked sky, the final defenders of Valo turned to face the storm. The Marauders' banners fluttered in the wind, their black sails an unyielding omen of what had come to pass. Yet even as the city burned below, the flames of resistance burned brighter still. Amid the smoke and fire, amidst the cries of the wounded and the fall of the fortress, a single truth remained. The Nihil may have taken Valo, but they had not taken its people. And in the ashes of the city, as the last transports carried the survivors away, the seed of defiance was sown. The Nihil were masters of chaos, their strength lying not just in their unpredictable raids, but in the brutal unity forged by the 4 Tempest runners. For years, these 4 leaders had shaped the Marauders into a force that defied the Republic's might, guiding their followers with relentless ambition and a shared devotion to the eye of the Nihil. But unity, like all things, is fragile, and even the most formidable storms can fracture when the winds change. The Tempest runners, once bound by a shared vision, began to turn on one another. The power struggle brewing within their ranks was as inevitable as the chaos they had wrought. Whispers of betrayal began to swirl through the Nihil, carried on the winds of discontent. Each runner, Ziri, Marchion, Lorna, and Cass, held a piece of the storm, but no longer did they all look in the same direction. Ziri, the sharp-tongued strategist, had always believed in the strength of order within chaos. Her calculated approaches, often at odds with the other runners' more impulsive tactics, had earned her both respect and envy. As the Nihil's attacks became increasingly unpredictable, she pushed for more control, a tighter grip on their operations. But Cass, her former ally and the leader of the Nihil's most ferocious Tempests, saw Ciri's push for order as a betrayal of the very thing that had made them unstoppable: chaos. "Control is an illusion," Cass had sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "It's the storm that defines us, not the calm before it." Lorna, always the wild card, found herself caught between them, her loyalty divided. She had led her Tempest with fervor, a constant force of destruction, but her loyalty to the eye of the Nihil was unwavering. The eye spoke to her, and its words were as sacred as any scripture. But the eye's silence, its lack of direction, had left Lorna questioning if she was truly serving its will, or if she had been serving the whims of power-hungry leaders. Marchion, the most ruthless of them all, saw this discord as an opportunity. Ambitious and calculating, he knew the fracture within the ranks would either destroy them or solidify his dominance. For years he had quietly manipulated the others, pulling strings from the shadows. The cracks in the unity of the 4 Tempest runners were his to exploit. He had no loyalty but to the Nihil's ultimate conquest, and he would see his vision realized, no matter the cost. As the storm of dissent grew, a confrontation seemed inevitable. The day came when the Tempest runners, unable to quell their growing mistrust, faced each other in the storm-scarred heart of their flagship. The ship, a colossal vessel that had once been the epitome of their power, now seemed like a broken thing, its decks trembling beneath the weight of their fractured unity. There, atop the ship's shattered bridge, where the storm winds howled through the broken hull, the runners faced one another. The air was thick with tension, the ground slick with the residue of past battles. Ciri's sharp, cold gaze met Cass's fiery eyes, and Marchion's calculating expression lingered between them as Lorna stood quietly, waiting for the inevitable. "You want to control the storm," Cass growled, stepping forward, his armored fists clenched. "You want to tame the chaos that made us great?" Ciri's voice was a low whisper, sharp as a blade's edge. "I want us to survive, Cass. This constant unpredictability, this recklessness, it will destroy us." "You fear the chaos," Cass spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's in our blood. We are the storm. Without it, we are nothing." And then, the moment of reckoning arrived. Without a word, the two charged. Cass's form a blur of motion, his weapons drawn, the Tempest's fury in every strike. Ciri, never one to shy away from a fight, met him head-on, her blade flashing in the dim light of the storm-swept deck. The clash was fierce, their lightsabers crackling with the energy of their conflict, a violent dance of power and fury. Above them, The skies raged, the storm mirroring the chaos on the deck below. Lightning cracked through the atmosphere, illuminating their battle for all to see. Each strike, each move, was a testament to the ideological divide that had torn the Nihil apart. It was not just a duel of strength, but a vision of what the Nihil were meant to be. Lorna and Marcion stood at the edge of the battle, their gazes locked. Lorna's expression was unreadable, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Marcion, however, stood with the cool calm of a predator. He knew which way the storm was blowing. As the two leaders fought, it became clear. Unity had slipped through their fingers. The Nihil, once a singular force of chaos, was now splintering into competing factions. Who would emerge from this storm? Cass with his fire, Jiri with her vision of control, or Marcion with his quiet, patient ambition, was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The Nihil were no longer the united force they once had been, and in their fractured state, the true storm was yet to come. As the storm's grip tightened around the galaxy, a new enigma stirred, one that eluded even the keenest eyes. From the heart of the Nihil's chaos, secret messages slithered through the fractured reaches of hyperspace, whispering truths and half-truths alike. No one could say for certain what the eye of the Nihil truly was, or how deeply its tendrils had woven themselves into the fabric of the Marauders' ideology. But the clues were undeniable. A holocom flickered in the darkened chamber of a Jedi cruiser, its projection sputtering like an old flame in the wind. The insignia displayed was strange, a simple blindfold, an eye obscured. No one could read it with certainty, not yet. But they knew the significance. The eye, the mark of something more than just a mere cult. It was the heart of their rebellion, the guiding force behind their most destructive schemes. The question lingered: what did they seek? And who did they serve? Across the galaxy, small groups of Nihil operatives worked in the shadows, weaving complex transmissions that spread like smoke through broken hyperspace lanes. These were not ordinary messages, not simple communications between Marauders. They were coded, hidden beneath layers of encryption so deep only a select few could decrypt them. They called it the Whispering Eye, a phrase that echoed like a distant cry, carried on the galactic winds. For the Jedi, these transmissions were a maddening puzzle. At first, they had dismissed them as nothing more than the ramblings of the Nihil, a marauder faction lost in their own chaos. But as the messages became more frequent, their content began to shift. Hidden beneath their coded surface were hints of something larger, something older, a presence that the Jedi had only heard of in whispered legends. A task force was assembled to track the source of these transmissions. Jedi Knights, their minds trained to interpret the most subtle of force signatures, were dispatched to the most dangerous regions of space, regions where the very fabric of hyperspace was warped by the Nihil's chaotic influence. They navigated through debris fields, past shattered hulls, where the fragmented remnants of previous encounters lay frozen in time. Every transmission they intercepted carried the same strange signature: a pulse, a faint vibration in the force, a trace of something beyond the material. And within those pulses, they began to sense something familiar, an old presence, the shadow of an ancient, forgotten threat. The coded messages, written in a cipher as old as the galaxy itself, grew increasingly elaborate. They hinted at secrets buried beneath the galaxy's surface, pointing to the existence of a greater power, one tied not to the Force, but to something far darker. The Eye of the Nihil had become not just a symbol, but a key to unlock whatever lay hidden in the void between the stars. Despite their efforts, the Jedi could not fully decrypt the transmissions. There were no clear answers, only fragments, broken whispers from a shattered future. The mystery of the Eye remained as elusive as ever, each new transmission deepening the uncertainty. Who was behind the messages? And what did they truly want? The Jedi could only wait, haunted by the knowledge that the answers might come too late. The holocom continued to flicker in the dim light of the cruiser, its blindfolded emblem casting a long shadow across the floor. The Jedi gazed at it, feeling the weight of the unknown press against their spirits. The Eye of the Nihil was not just a symbol of their chaos. It was a beacon, calling to something darker, something none could yet name. And as the stars blinked and hummed around them, the Jedi knew that the answers to this mystery lay just out of reach, hidden in the spaces between the stars. But with each passing day, the whispers grew louder, and the presence behind them closer. The Eye of the Nihil had only begun to reveal its secrets. The storm had been building for years, gathering strength with every raid, every whispered alliance, and every stolen fleet. The Nihil, anarchic and unpredictable, had always been a force of chaos, scattered, disparate, impossible to predict. But now, the winds had changed. The scattered tempests, once fragmented and disjointed, were converging. All the separate pieces of the Nihil's sprawling empire were finally coming together. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. In the heart of the storm, Tempest runners began their final preparations. No longer content with mere raids and petty destruction, they had set their sights on something far greater. This would not be a war of skirmishes. It would be a galaxy-shaking strike. A single, devastating blow that would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the Republic and beyond. The Tempests began to form, one by one, each a massive fleet of black sails and twisted ships. In the cold vacuum of space, their ships moved like shadows, dark and silent, gathering together beneath the cold, unblinking eyes of two distant moons. These moons, once forgotten, now watched closely by those who knew their significance, would witness the coming of the storm. Each black sail was a symbol of the chaos to come. The Nihil ships, rope-like and serpentine, glided across the stars, their jagged forms cutting through the vastness of space like a blade through the dark. Thousands of them, dozens of fleets, all converging on one point. They were not just Marauders now. They were a storm that would lay waste to everything in its path. The forces gathered around the twin moons as if they were drawn by an invisible force. The skies above the surface began to churn as the ships dropped out of hyperspace, their engines leaving behind traces of burning light. The Nihil fleet was ready. They had come together for one purpose: to strike at the heart of the galaxy with the full force of their unpredictable fury. On the surface of one of the moons, beneath the weight of 1,000 gathering ships, the Tempest runners stood side by side. Their faces hidden by masks, their eyes gleaming with the madness of their cause. They had lived in the storm, and now the storm was theirs to command. Their hands gripped the symbols of their power, the banners of their rebellion, which fluttered in the artificial winds created by their fleet. This was their moment, the culmination of everything they had fought for. The Nihil had never been about order or control, not like the Republic or the Jedi. It was about freedom, the freedom to burn, to destroy, to erase the existing order and replace it with something new. And now, in this final strike, they would do just that. The Republic would never see it coming. Behind the Tempest runners, the fleet's ships shifted and began to align, their forms slipping into formation with eerie precision. It was as if they had become one unified organism, a living, breathing storm. The black sails of their ships fluttered ominously against the void, casting long shadows across the cold moons. These ships, each representing a Tempest, would soon descend upon the Republic's most vulnerable points. The final strike would come with a fury unmatched. No one would be prepared. The galaxy's defenses would crumble, and in the chaos, the Nihil would carve out their place. They would leave nothing but ashes and the memory of their storm. They had no desire to rule. They did not want peace. The Nihil wanted destruction, pure and simple. They would break the galaxy into pieces, and from those pieces, they would build something entirely new. A world without order, a galaxy without boundaries. As the final ships of the fleet came into place, their black sails fluttered like the wings of a great bird of prey preparing to dive into the unknown. The first stage of their plan was complete. And now, the final blow would fall. All the Tempests, 4, 5, 1,000, were united. A single, catastrophic wave of destruction, ready to sweep through the Republic's heart. From the surface, the two moons stood silent, like ancient sentinels watching over the gathering storm. There was no wind here, no rustling of leaves, only the sound of 1,000 ships aligning, their engines pulsing in unison. The storm was nearly upon them. The galaxy had been warned, but they had not been prepared. And in the cold shadows of space, beneath the twin moons, the Nihil gathered their strength. The storm was almost here. As the Nihil's shadow engulfs the High Republic, another terror lurks beyond the fringe, silent, unseen, and born of fear itself. We now turn from marauders of chaos to predators of the mind, and then silence. As the thunder of the Nihil fleets faded beyond the outer rim, a new presence stirred, quieter, deeper, more ancient than war itself. It did not come with starships or banners, nor with threats shouted across comm channels. It came in moments between breaths, in the quiet chambers of Jedi meditation, in dreams, and in the places where the Force should speak, but did not. The first Jedi to sense it did not speak at first. They weren't sure what they'd felt, only that something had shifted. A disturbance not of noise, but of stillness. A whisper where there should have been clarity. They described it not as a voice, but as an absence, a pressure behind the veil of thought, like being watched by something that had no eyes, no shape, only intent. In the temple on Aram, Master Kiri Nolan lit a candle each evening, kneeling in meditation as she had since her Padawan years. On the 15th night after the siege of Valo, the flame faltered. Just once, the air had not moved. The chamber was sealed. And yet, as her eyes opened, she saw it. A flicker, a shadow not cast by anything. Her mind reached for the Force and found it strangely dulled, like a thread pulled taut and thinning. That night, her dreams did not feel like dreams. Elsewhere, Padawans woke screaming. Veterans of battle found themselves afraid to close their eyes. And in the sanctuaries of light, where the Jedi had long stood firm, unease began to spread. Something had entered their awareness, but without form, without origin. No signature in the Force, no trail to follow, just an encroaching sense of dread. Not terror, but the knowledge that terror was near. What made it worse, what made it real, was that not every Jedi could sense it. Those who did were often brushed aside at first. Exhaustion, trauma, the lingering echoes of battle. But the stories multiplied. The details varied, but the essence was the same. Something was watching, something that knew them, that slipped through their defenses, not by force, but by fear. This presence, whatever it was, did not trip sensors or alarms. It did not appear on scanners. It moved in thought and silence. It reached into the minds of those attuned to the Force and folded itself within the folds of their perception. Where Jedi should have felt the currents of life and balance, there was instead a growing dead zone, a place where the Force no longer whispered back. A night from the starlight beacon, Thero Quen recorded in his hololog, "I dream of being chased, but I never see the one chasing me. I feel them, right behind, not footsteps, not breath, just the certainty of being hunted. I wake, and the certainty remains." Investigations began quietly. The Council did not dismiss the claims, but neither did they publicize them. A sense of discretion was vital. Panic among Jedi was rare, but not impossible. And whatever this was, it preyed on exactly that. Some whispered of echoes from the past, of old Sith rituals and remnants from darker times. But there was no trace, no evidence, only flickers of memory, shared nightmares, and the lingering impression of a predator just beyond sight. And still the candle flickered. From the deep reaches of uncharted space, from ancient places the Republic had never mapped, the presence seeped inward like mist beneath a sealed door. It needed no army, no proclamation. It crept into the hearts of the galaxy's guardians and made them question the one thing they trusted most, their connection to the Force itself. In time, these experiences would be given a name. But names are power, and this was still nameless. For now, it remained what it had always been, a shadow moving between thoughts, a whisper in the dark. And with that whisper, the true test of the Jedi had begun. Fear had always been a danger for Jedi, not fear of pain or death, but the kind that takes root in the soul and whispers doubt. Fear that twists perception, that corrodes faith. The Jedi were taught to move beyond it. But how do you defeat something that feeds on fear? Something that draws strength not from a weapon, but from the moment a Jedi questions their own certainty? After weeks of hushed reports and trembling confessions, a name finally emerged among researchers, drawn from ancient records buried deep beneath the Jedi archives and obscure Sith fragments long hidden: the Nameless. The designation was not poetic. It was literal. These entities defied classification, slipping beyond every known system of taxonomy. They had no fixed shape, no traditional anatomy. Instead, they existed as shifting masses, tendrils of warped biology, interlaced with something darker, something the Force itself recoiled from. Amorphous and ever-shifting, their presence couldn't be captured in traditional scans, only glimpsed by the mind. Jedi who survived their encounters described sensations more than visuals. A flickering presence at the edge of awareness, a pressure behind the eyes, and most disturbingly, a kind of internal unraveling, as if something had reached inside them, not physically but spiritually, and begun to feed. In truth, that wasn't far from reality. For the Nameless did not hunt with claws or teeth. They devoured connection. Specifically, a Jedi's bond to the Force. That sacred current which guided and empowered them became a lure, and then a weakness. As the Nameless drew close, that connection frayed. Lightsabers dimmed, minds clouded. The natural harmony within the Jedi dissolved into panic, and from that panic, the creatures drank. The Sith had once tried to control them, long ago. Fragmented scrolls recovered from forbidden vaults tell of rituals, terrible and precise, meant to lure the Nameless into servitude. But they could not be tamed. They were not born of the dark side, but the dark side bent toward them like gravity to a star. Their existence echoed that same hunger, emptiness seeking fulfillment through consumption of light. In his private report, Master Belladran of the Archive Circle wrote, "They do not kill in the way predators do. They unravel. One moment, a Jedi is whole. The next, their center is gone. What remains is a shell, fear-racked and frozen, as if the soul has been siphoned away." Biologists, those brave enough to study the remains of indirect encounters, have noted that the Nameless leave behind no wounds, only corpses locked in expressions of profound, final terror. What few cellular fragments have been recovered suggest organic material unlike any known classification, ever-shifting molecular bonds, adaptive structure, a nervous system, if it could be called that, which functioned more like a field than an organ, matter influenced by thought, flesh guided by perception, and always the same haunting pattern. Jedi die fastest. Force sensitives crumble within moments of exposure. Others, civilians, droids, even non-sensitives, remain untouched or simply experience the area as unnervingly quiet. But Jedi, they are torn apart from the inside. The Nameless don't just sense fear, they amplify it. Like an echo chamber of horror, they reflect a Jedi's anxieties until the mind fractures beneath the weight. And once that breach opens, their tendrils slide through. In dream studies conducted at remote enclaves, images returned again and again, webs of light being threaded through with black filaments, faces twisted in silent screams, shimmering strands of Force energy tangled like fishing line, until nothing remained but stillness. The Jedi began to realize this was no ordinary threat. It was not something to be countered with battalions or battle meditation. It was a predator that hunted not the body, but the bond between mind and mystery, between self and serenity. And as the whispers became truths, the Order's silence deepened. Because how do you confront a creature that erases the very thing that makes you Jedi? The next phase was clear. If these beings could not be defeated by strength or knowledge, then perhaps they could be understood, or at least tracked. Even as research into the Nameless deepened, the true horror they inspired could not be contained within archives or theories. It lived, vivid and restless, within the minds of those who had come too close. One such case began in the night chambers of Padawan Erinsa Tal. Young, Curious and unusually attuned to the emotional ripples of the Force, Erinsa had once been considered a prodigy of empathy. But in the weeks following her master's assignment to track disturbances near the Outer Rim, her dreams began to shift. At first they were vague, the feeling of being watched while alone in meditation, the sense that something else occupied the room, breathing, though she heard no sound. Then came the visions, fleeting glimpses of twisted figures glimpsed through rain-slicked glass. A reflection that blinked when she did not. And then, the mirror. It stood across from her bunk, ordinary and unremarkable. But one night, Erinsa awoke and found it fogged from the inside. A pale hand, not hers, pressed against the glass. Long fingers, impossibly thin, etched with veins of shifting darkness. When she moved to touch it, the reflection delayed, as though following a second behind. What she saw next was not a dream. She awoke screaming. Her master found her trembling, lights flickering overhead. The mirror had shattered, but there were no signs of impact. Just one long streak across the frame, as if something had clawed its way out. Across the Order, stories like hers multiplied, visions merging with waking life, reality distorting around those who had encountered the Nameless, or even merely heard of them. In Erinsa's case, the nightmares escalated. She became convinced something was stalking her, not in the galaxy, but in her mind. Her senses, once clear, became unreliable. The Force whispered, but she could no longer trust its voice. It was as if the Nameless had taken root in her psyche, burrowing between the conscious and unconscious, weaving dread like a spider in silk. When she meditated, she saw not light, but corridors without end, each echoing with footsteps not her own. Master Oren, an expert in psychic affliction, was assigned to her case. He hypothesized that the Nameless were not just feeding on fear, they were planting seeds. That in some rare individuals, exposure allowed the creatures to forge a kind of anchor through shared perception. They lived in the spaces between what was seen and what was believed. In his words, these creatures do not simply kill the Jedi, they haunt them. Their attack is not an event, it's a process, a tether woven from panic, disorientation, and eventual despair. During one monitored session, Erinsa described standing in a barren courtyard beneath a blood-colored moon. Statues surrounded her, faceless and tall. They began to turn, slowly, and one lifted its arm, not carved stone, but flesh and sinew, emerging directly from her mind's image of the mirror. She awoke to find her room freezing, her lightsaber dead, and the scent of scorched stone in the air. The council grew divided. Was this madness? Or a new kind of battlefield? One not of worlds, but within the very essence of a Jedi's being. If the Nameless could cross the barrier between nightmare and waking, where could a Jedi truly be safe? The tragedy of Erinsa Tal became a warning, a living reminder of the psychological war unfolding in shadows. The Force was no longer a refuge. Its very threads could be plucked and unraveled, laced with dread by invisible hands. More than ever, the Order began to question the nature of this enemy. For while blasters and blades could wound the flesh, what weapon could sever a horror that did not come from outside, but from within? The Jedi would need more than courage now. They would need clarity of mind, unity of purpose, and perhaps a way to face the dark, even when it wore their own face. The Order had long taught that fear was a shadow cast by ignorance, but with discipline and serenity, a Jedi could overcome even the darkest trials of the mind. But the Nameless did not challenge belief. They unraveled it. What Erin Satal endured would echo across the Order. But she was not alone. Jedi Knights, seasoned and scarred from a dozen battles, began reporting strange symptoms: drained energy, fragmented memories, a creeping detachment from the Force itself. Meditation no longer brought peace. Dreams dissolved into static. And the most chilling sign, lightsabers refusing to ignite. Not from malfunction, not from sabotage, but from something deeper. Master Cleas Adar, once a renowned lightsaber instructor at the temple on Coruscant, described the moment with trembling hands. During a solitary mission to Felucia, he'd felt it. A wave of suffocating silence, pressing inward like cold water around the lungs. He reached for his weapon, his companion through wars and peacekeeping alike, and the blade sputtered, then died, its crystal dim and unresponsive. He returned not broken, but dulled, hollow-eyed, as if something vital had been scraped from within. The healers began to see patterns. The affliction spread not through wounds of flesh, but fractures of spirit. Those affected often spoke in metaphors. The light feels farther away, or my saber no longer sings. Their Force presence grew muted, as though they were wrapped in fog. But worse than the silence was the apathy. The Nameless fed on more than fear. They hollowed out conviction, hope, passion, even grief, all withered into a numb vacancy. Jedi who once stood between tyrants and the helpless now struggled to rise from their sleep mats. Tasks once done without thought, simple meditation, quiet reflection, became unbearable burdens. And beneath it all was a gnawing, formless dread, a feeling that nothing they did could matter, that no effort would be enough. Some described a presence always just out of sight, not stalking them, but waiting for them to stop resisting. Jedi Master Brellan Toy, a philosopher of the living Force, attempted to map the effects through dream logs and pattern recalls. But even she, articulate and mentally disciplined, began to falter. Her final entry before self-exile read, "There is no edge to this darkness. I cannot tell where I end and it begins. If the Force is a river, then I am already drowning." The sabers of the afflicted were collected and examined. Many still functioned when tested in isolation, but in the hands of their wielders, they flickered, dimmed, and eventually went cold. One saber, placed in a sealed chamber, pulsed faintly when left alone, but extinguished entirely when its Jedi approached. It became clear, the Nameless did not just terrify, they consumed meaning. They devoured the will that made a Jedi who they were, not through direct assault, but by fracturing the mind, piece by imperceptible piece, until only silence remained. This was not a sickness, it was erasure. And the Order could not fight it with conventional strategy. Blades could not cut despair. Shields could not deflect disconnection from the very essence of the Force. What weapon, then, did they have? Some clung to rituals, to the companionship of their peers. Others sought ancient knowledge, forgotten paths, whispers from the old Republic. But more and more, Jedi simply disappeared. Some in body, others in presence, fading slowly, like stars swallowed by mist. One chamber in the temple, once used for saber construction, was dimmed indefinitely. It held the flickering remnants of hollowed cores, crystals inert, their light spent, humming no longer in harmony with the minds that once gave them purpose. Each one marked a story of silent unraveling, and in each, The Nameless had whispered not in language, but in absence. Yet still, the order did not fall. Something endured beneath the fear. A flicker, a breath, a thought. We are not alone. And that was where the tide would one day begin to turn. In the wake of quiet sabers and dimmed spirits, the silence itself began to speak. Not through official channels, not through the council, but through whispers, carried on freighter comms, trader gossip, intercepted signals in half-broken code. The rumors spread like a shadow cast across hyperspace, vague in form, but undeniable in weight. Jedi were vanishing, and not in battle. They were dissolving, withdrawn, disconnected, undone. At first, it was dismissed as war trauma, a psychological affliction. But then, too many patterns emerged to ignore. A name surfaced, not official, not recorded in the archives, but passed along like a curse. The Nameless. Outposts that once pulsed with the calm hum of routine now sat in tension. Corridors dimmed themselves at odd intervals. Lights flickered. Meditation chambers were left empty for days. And the hollow monitors, those ever-flickering devices that connected even the most remote enclaves, began to go dark. First in ones, then in clusters. A hallway in the northern annex of the Mirandal outpost lay deserted. Rows of wall-mounted hollow units once used for Jedi-to-Jedi communication sat silent, cold light reflecting against durasteel floors. Their recordings looped static or garbled voices, faces once clear now blurred by interference. Some screens displayed only a symbol, a blindfold over a circle, origin unknown. Padawan Jasik of Rilo Station reported hearing the monitors speak to him in his dreams, not with words, but sensations. Echoes of cold breath, metallic fingers, and a pressure at the back of the skull. He withdrew from missions. Within weeks, his master found him in the monitor corridor, staring into one of the dead screens. When approached, he simply said, "They know I'm awake." He was transferred to Coruscant for healing. He never spoke again. The Order's investigators scrambled to understand what was happening. No physical evidence tied these breakdowns together, no toxins, no dark side residue detectable through traditional means. But the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the Nameless had been felt, technology began to flicker, minds began to unravel, and fear lingered like mist. It wasn't just Jedi who noticed. Cargo haulers began changing routes to avoid old temple sectors. Station keepers requested non-Jedi patrols. Even smugglers, men and women who had dealt with Sith artifacts and cursed vaults, spoke in hushed voices about ghost stations and dead zones. A cultural shift took root, a soft superstition. Jedi robes were no longer worn openly in border systems. Lightsabers were kept hidden. In some quarters of the galaxy, to name the Nameless aloud was thought to invite their gaze. On Elfrona, an enclave of archivists broke protocol and initiated a ritual purge, wiping their own memory banks of all references to the creatures, believing that ignorance might offer protection. One message was left behind, carved into a durasteel panel above the outpost's main hall. "To forget is not weakness, it is shelter." The Council hesitated to act publicly. To acknowledge a threat it did not understand was to admit vulnerability. So the silence deepened. It became contagious. Even those not directly affected felt it. A weight behind every transmission, a stillness in every room. And yet, some welcomed it. On Skoth Prime, an extremist cult of former Jedi students began preaching that the Force was meant to be unmade, that the Nameless were not predators, but liberators. They called them the Unravelers. They burned their sabers in public ceremony and invited the darkness in, believing freedom lay beyond selfhood. The Order denounced them. But still, the message spread. Because silence is seductive, and fear, true fear, is not panic. It is not screaming. It is not even flight. It is the moment when nothing moves, when every instinct tells you to run, yet you stand still because the unknown might already be inside you. In that corridor of dead hollow monitors, one screen flickered back to life for 6 seconds, enough to show a figure in silhouette. Its outline was impossible to place. No face, no features, only a vague distortion, as if space itself recoiled from its presence. The monitor shorted out. The corridor was sealed.
No official report was filed.
But every Jedi who walked those halls afterward walked a little faster, and none lingered too long. They thought they could trace the echoes from the ruined enclaves, from the garbled transmissions, from the drifting stations where thoughts once moved like song across the stars. The Jedi believed, still, in signs, patterns of movement, disturbances in the currents of the Force, the ripples left by things that walk unseen. So they hunted, quietly, carefully, through cold asteroids and lightless ruins, through systems where comms had fallen silent. Masters and Padawans, guided not by orders from Coruscant, but by intuition and dread. Some returned, fewer each time. It began with trails, subtle, nearly imperceptible impressions in the Force, like frost melting where no light touched, like a footfall that left no weight, only memory. These threads led teams into forgotten temples, deep tunnels beneath long-abandoned Jedi way stations, and space folds where hyperspace currents thinned like torn fabric. Master Hreth Tarn, a Myriolan seer known for his clairvoyant depth, followed one such impression to the shadow side of Colta Minor. His journals described whispers beneath the gravity well and heat without flame. When he failed to report, a recovery detail was sent. They found only his robes, folded beside a patch of scorched ice, and a trail of footprints that faded mid-step into swirling mist. That mist never dispersed. It clung to the cave mouth for days, like breath waiting to be inhaled. The Jedi began to notice something else. The more they sought the Nameless, the less grounded they felt in themselves. Identity blurred, time warped, thoughts fractured. Some swore they were being watched, not just in the field, but in the temple itself. Night, Les Lavore described her final field mission in a fragmented hololog recovered from her starfighter's navcore. In it, she whispers, not to the recorder, but seemingly to herself. I see them only when I stop looking. That's the trick. It's not about where they are. It's about where I am. In here. The last image from her flight recorder, a streak of vapor spiraling behind her ship. Not a missile, not a vessel, just motion, erasing itself as it moved. Over time, the hunters lost clarity. Their movements grew erratic. Reports were riddled with contradictions. The Force grew silent in pockets around them, like air sucked from a room. And then the shift occurred. They were no longer chasing. They were being drawn in. Knight Faroon and his Padawan Ailu crossed into a red dust system beyond Lithos Belt. following a signature so faint it barely registered. They found nothing, no structure, no signal, just planetfall in perpetual fog. But Ferron's last transmission, barely a whisper across static, was clear enough. Ailu's gone. Just turned away for a moment. I feel something inside me. Forgetting. He never finished. From that point forward, the Jedi changed their approach. No longer did they seek signs. They sought absence, places where the Force should have spoken and did not, where animals did not stir, where air did not hum, where even light hesitated. These null zones became markers, not of the nameless presence, but of its feeding ground. The Jedi realized that the Nameless were not chasing them. They were luring them, offering just enough trace for pursuit, drawing in hunters not as a threat, but as sustenance. Still, some could not resist the chase. A lone Padawan, Ceres Navo, set out alone after her master vanished near the ruins of Ivex's tower. She left a message behind, burned into the wall of her meditation chamber.
If I become lost, I pray it is not to fear, but to understanding.
She was never seen again. And now, in the outer reaches of the Rim, footprints appear in places where no Jedi have tread for centuries. Not footprints left, but forming, etched slowly into dust that stirs without wind. A swirl of mist rises. A shadow waits. And the hunters who once moved with certainty now walk unsure, their path behind them unraveling. For those who could no longer trust their eyes or the Force, answers had to come from elsewhere. Where the Jedi faltered in shadows, there were others willing to face the dark head-on. Scholars who had once studied the ancient wars from the safety of archives began reaching into forbidden spaces, probing sealed knowledge where doctrine had placed locks. The Order's silence had failed them, so they turned instead to echoes. One such seeker was Dr. Maltel Vahn, a historian once commissioned by the Republic to catalogue the Sith Wars. He vanished for nearly a year after a classified request to access relics from the vaults beneath Ossus. When he resurfaced, his hands were scarred with etched symbols, and his voice trembled when he spoke the name of the thing he had found, Eater of Essence. Vahn's writings, later recovered from the ruins of his remote outpost, were stitched across dozens of fragmented datapads. At their core, a cracked Sith holocron, its housing ruptured, leaking red light like blood through crystal. He called it the Veil Shard. Within it were accounts not of war, but of hunger, entities, ancient, amorphous, not bound by form, but thought, not creatures of the physical, but of the psyche, drifting through emotion, feeding on dread and unraveling will. The Sith who recorded these findings had not named them. They had feared to. Their words, written in riddled Kitat, spoke of the unmade, the breathless watchers, and those whose gaze breaks the self. According to Vahn, these beings were not creations of the dark side, but cohabitants of it, symbiotes of terror, lurkers at the edges of sentience. He found symbols too, a recurring motif, a spiral inside a cracked circle, often drawn at the threshold of ancient meditation vaults. Warnings. Not to enter, but not to think. The act of attention itself drew them closer. In one particularly chilling record, a Sith cultist chronicled his descent into madness after gazing too long into a Force mirror. His final words were not a plea, but a surrender. They were always inside. They just needed me to look. Dr. Vaughn began to speak of dreams, long corridors winding into impossible geometries, whispers that came not from behind him, but inside the symbols he read. He reported days vanishing from his memory, waking with Sith glyphs scorched into the durasteel walls of his study. His final message was brief, a raw, choked recording etched into the veil shard itself.
They are not new. They are old. We just stopped remembering.
Not long after, the Republic dispatched a containment team to his facility. They found the holocron still glowing, pulsing faintly in the center of an abandoned chamber. No sign of Vaughn. Only shadows that didn't quite align with their sources, and data terminals wiped clean, save for a single repeating phrase in Kitat. Thought is the doorway. This began a quiet fracture among Jedi archivists and scholars. A few, against the Council's wishes, started their own clandestine investigations, trading knowledge behind veils of secrecy. They whispered of similarities in ancient Rakatan records, even obscure Chiss legends, all describing void beasts or mind drinkers. Patterns emerging, names repeating. Yet even among those seeking truth, something unspoken lingered, a hesitation, as if the act of speaking these findings aloud could invite them. One Jedi researcher, Master Vosia Tal, locked herself in her quarters for 6 days after touching the veil shard. When she emerged, she said only, "Some echoes should remain echoes." But the silence was no longer safe, because now the Nameless had names. Now they were remembered, and memory is a signal. As more Jedi vanished, and as Force null zones widened, it became clear. Knowledge alone was not protection. The Nameless did not care for logic or study. They came not for minds filled with reason, but for those haunted by fear. The veil had been pierced, and something was coming through. They built the Enclave to endure silence. High above the frozen cliffs of Vitar's Reach, carved into a mountain older than memory, the Jedi had once shaped a bastion of peace. Fewer than a dozen kept vigil there, teachers, archivists, and their apprentices, guarding wisdom the galaxy had nearly forgotten. The wind howled around them like a chorus of ghosts, and the Force, when still, flowed clear and bright. But when the silence shifted, they knew it. It did not arrive as a scream or a storm. It came with absence. Meditation chambers where thought once moved like water grew stagnant. The presence of the Force, so constant it went unnoticed, grew thin, then cold, then quiet. At first, they blamed the elevation, the climate, a bad rotation. But one by one, the apprentices stopped sleeping. They whispered of shadows they could not follow, shapes in the edges of their thoughts, a pressure in the mind, like being watched from inside. Master Telran Voss was the first to sense it clearly, not through vision, but the absence of vision. He meditated in the oldest vault, alone, and felt his awareness reach into the mountain, where once there had been life, stone, air. Now, there was only void, not emptiness. Something worse. Hollow presence. Something that fed on the act of noticing. That night, Padawan Miri Kale screamed herself awake and did not stop. She clawed at the walls of her chamber, begging to be let out, though the door was wide open. Her mind unraveled before her master's eyes, not from pain, but from terror so complete it erased reason. Master Voss ordered a full lockdown. No one was to leave, no one to enter. All communications were severed by interference, and in the stillness that followed came the siege. It wasn't a force they could fight. No battalions, no starships, just shadows, seeping through thoughts, through dreams, a slow unraveling of certainty. Knights found themselves forgetting forms they had mastered. Names faded from memory. Some stared into the glow panes for hours, unmoving, lips muttering phrases that made no sense. Others collapsed into quiet despair. But not all fell. Knight Iriah Thane, youngest of the Enclave's defenders, had grown up amid conflict. War orphan, survivor of the Sullustan uprisings. Her strength had never been power in the Force. It was resolve. When the creatures pressed into her mind, she did not push back. She stood still. She watched. She did not resist the fear. She recognized it. On the sixth day, when even the eldest masters began to lose themselves, Iriah walked into the central meditation chamber. Around her, the others cowered in darkened corners. She ignited her blade, soft blue, and placed it point down into the stone floor. The light, dim and flickering, cast a ring that seemed to hold the shadows at bay. Then she closed her eyes and began to speak, not to the creatures, but to her fellow Jedi. She spoke of fear as a thread that binds, not breaks, of strength drawn not from defiance, but from presence. She reminded them of the code, not as law, but as anchor. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. As she spoke, something shifted. The shadows did not flee, but they paused. And in that pause, the Jedi remembered who they were. Not because the threat had passed, but because they had chosen not to yield. Because even when light faltered, one among them stood, and that was enough. By the time Republic relief forces arrived weeks later, they found the Enclave scarred, hollowed in places, but intact. The survivors did not speak much. They bore their trauma quietly. But in the center chamber, the floor still bore the mark of a saber, burned into the stone in a perfect ring. A place where one Jedi had stood, unwavering, as the dark pressed in. The records do not agree on where the circle was formed. Some whisper it was on Elfrona, in the shadow of ancient vaults. Others claim Jeddah, high in the freezing winds near the old Temple of Kyber. A few say the moment transcended place, that it happened wherever Jedi stood together in defiance of the void. But all agree on this. It began with a gathering. The Nameless had grown bolder. Their presence, once ephemeral, had solidified into something that could not be ignored. Across distant outposts and frontier moons, Jedi continued to vanish, some screaming into madness, others simply fading, as if unraveled from within. Fear had taken root, deeper than any blade could reach. But as the Order frayed, so too did it adapt. Master Avar Kriss, known not for might, but for her rare attunement to the Force as music, was among the first to sense a possible answer. Where others saw darkness as an encroaching tide, she felt it as a dissonance. A wrong note struck in the symphony of the galaxy. Not something to fight head-on, but something to balance. She proposed something untried, dangerous, uncertain. Jedi from a dozen systems were summoned, not for battle, but for harmony. Among them, battle-scarred knights, hesitant Padawans, lost masters who had nearly succumbed to the very dread they now faced. They gathered in silence beneath a shattered sky on a world never named in the archives. The Force flowed among them, tattered, unsure, but still present. They formed a circle, not as a shield, as an offering. Each ignited their saber, the colors flickering against the broken stone. Blue, green, amber, violet. One by one, their voices joined, not in chant, but in quiet remembrance. Stories of resilience, moments of peace, names of the fallen, names of those still held in love. Hope was not declared. It was felt. The Nameless came, drawn by the pulse of gathered strength. The ground cracked beneath unseen steps. Frost laced the air. Shadows moved without form or direction. And then, pressure. As if the world itself sought to collapse inward. The Jedi did not strike. They listened. And in listening, they found each other. From the stillness rose a resonance, subtle at first, a hum threading between them, carried through the Force. Not a weapon, not a shield, a presence. It surged as hearts aligned. Each Jedi became a node in a lattice of light and memory, a living echo of unity so profound it shook the air. The Nameless recoiled. No blade had touched them, but fear, their lifeblood, was gone. In its place stood something they could not digest, something immune to their unraveling. Togetherness. Avar's music soared then, not alone, but harmonized across 100 minds. A melody without origin, a luminous chord that connected them beyond space and time. Where once the Nameless had slipped through cracks in the mind, they now found no cracks to enter. Only presence, only peace. They fled, not screaming, not broken, but dispersed, like fog under the warmth of a rising sun. Whatever tethered them to this realm had frayed. When it was over, the lightsabers dimmed. No words were spoken, no victory declared. They had not defeated the Nameless, not truly, but they had endured. They had proven that light, when shared, was no longer fragile. From that moment, a technique was quietly passed between enclaves and temples. A practice not of power, but of remembrance. Circles formed in hidden places. Jedi no longer stood alone. And in the places where darkness gathered, where terror once consumed all, there were lights, tiny, defiant, unbreakable.